The steel door weighed 3 tons, locking from the inside with a deafening metallic thud. Dr. Meredith Foster sealed herself in, prepared to outlast the deadliest winter in a century. 6 months later, she cracked the hatch to a silent, unrecognizable world. The apocalypse hadn't come, something much worse had. Meredith's paranoia did not blossom overnight. It was a slow, creeping rot. Seeded years prior during her tenure as a structural vulnerability analyst for the regional power grid, she knew exactly how fragile the system was. She knew that a single, synchronized failure of 3 major substations could plunge half the continent into the dark ages. But knowing it intellectually was one thing. Surviving the catastrophic winter freeze of the previous decade, trapped in a freezing sedan on Interstate 70 for 3 days, was another. That trauma had rewired her. It had turned an analytical engineer into a woman who trusted concrete over community and canned goods over government promises. By the time she bought the isolated property on the outskirts of Blackwood, Colorado, Meredith had already finalized the blueprints. To her neighbor, an elderly retired mechanic named Frank Peterson, she was just building a reinforced root cellar. Frank would occasionally lean against his rusted pickup truck, sipping black coffee, and watch the excavators dig deep into the granite. He'd wave, entirely unbothered by her obsessive project, occasionally joking that she was preparing for the return of the Ice Age. Meredith would just offer a tight, polite smile. She wasn't preparing for the Ice Age. She was preparing for human nature when the lights went out for good. The bunker, nestled 40 feet below the frost line, was a marvel of paranoid engineering. It possessed independent, triple-redundant air scrubbers, a geothermal heating loop, and a hydroponic bay bathed in synthetic ultraviolet light. Her pantry shelves groaned under the weight of precisely calculated caloric reserves. Freeze, dried beef, 50-pound sacks of long-grain rice, and hundreds of jars of preserved vegetables she had canned herself. The trigger event arrived on a grim Tuesday, the 12th of November. The barometric pressure plummeted so fast it made Meredith's ears ache. Meteorological models had been tracking a massive, anomalous low-pressure system moving down from the Arctic, but the local anchors, men like Greg Jenkins on Channel 5, were sweating on live television. This wasn't just a blizzard. The National Weather Service had run out of color-coded warnings. They were projecting wind chills of 60 below zero, dumping unprecedented feet of snow in a matter of hours, all colliding with a series of high-altitude atmospheric rivers. Meredith sat at her kitchen island, the television blaring, her fingers tracing the rim of a ceramic mug. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen was a relentless stream of panic. Interstates closed. Flights grounded. Governor declaring a state of emergency. Rumors of preemptive grid shutdowns. She picked up her phone and dialed her sister, Chloe, who lived 400 miles away in Denver. "Meredith, please don't do this right now." Chloe's voice crackled through the receiver, layered over the sound of a bustling coffee shop. "I know the weather looks bad, but Derek and I are just going to hunker down in the apartment. The building has a backup generator." "A backup generator meant for elevators and hallway lights, Chloe," Meredith urged, her voice tight, trying to keep the rising panic out of her throat. "Not for heating a 40-story glass high-rise when the ambient temperature hits -50. You need to drive up here, now. Leave Derek if he won't come. You have a 4-hour window before the roads turn into a graveyard." Chloe sighed, the sound thick with years of accumulated exhaustion from dealing with her sister's anxieties. "I am not leaving my fiancé, and I am not driving into the mountains during a blizzard warning to sit in your concrete tomb. We'll be fine. Call me when the snow stops." The line clicked dead. Meredith stared at the phone. A profound, heavy sorrow washed over her, quickly hardening into resolve. She could not save people who refused to be saved. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, sickening shade of purple. The wind was no longer howling. It was shrieking, tearing the last dead leaves from the oak trees and violently rattling the reinforced glass of her cabin windows. The temperature gauge on her porch read 10 degrees, and the digital numbers were ticking down in real time. She grabbed her final go-bag, cast one last look around the cozy, wood-paneled cabin she knew she might never see again, and opened the heavy steel door in the floor of the pantry. The descent felt like stepping into a submarine. The air grew cooler, smelling of ozone and freshly poured concrete. When she reached the bottom of the reinforced stairwell, she initiated the lockdown protocol. She slammed the primary blast door shut. She grabbed the massive hydraulic wheel, turning it with all her strength. The mechanical groan of the steel locking pins, sliding into the reinforced concrete frame, echoed violently in the small space. Clack, clack, clack. Meredith stumbled back, breathing heavily. The silence that followed was absolute, instantly severing her from the violent storm above. She walked over to the main control panel and flipped the breaker. The diesel generator roared to life in its sound-dampened chamber, and the LED lights flickered on, bathing her subterranean world in sterile white light. She looked at the digital calendar mounted on the wall. November 12th. She estimated she would need to stay underground for at least 3 months, letting the worst of the winter and the inevitable societal collapse burn itself out before she emerged to assess the damage. She had sealed herself in. There was no turning back. The first few weeks were an exercise in rigid discipline. Meredith knew that underground, the human mind was its own worst enemy. Without the sun to dictate circadian rhythms, insanity could creep in like black mold. She established a strict, unyielding schedule. Wake up at 0600 hours. 1 hour of cardiovascular exercise on the manual treadmill. A breakfast of reconstituted oats and dried fruit. 3 hours of system maintenance checking the carbon dioxide scrubbers, testing the pH levels in the hydroponic water, and logging fuel consumption. In the afternoons, she allowed herself the luxury of reading. She devoured dense biographies and Russian literature, avoiding anything set in the modern era. The evenings were reserved for the radio. Meredith had wired a high-frequency ham radio to an antenna camouflaged within the chimney of the cabin above. Every night at 2000 hours, she would put on her headphones, slowly twisting the dial through the static, hunting for voices. During the first week, the airwaves were a chaotic symphony of human panic. She heard the frantic chatter of emergency responders, the automated loops of NOAA weather stations repeating dire warnings of grid failures, and the desperate, uncoordinated broadcasts of other survivalists. She learned that Denver's power grid had completely collapsed on day 3. She heard fragmented reports of massive, deadly pile-ups on the highways, and the frantic pleas of people trapped in freezing homes. It was a horrific validation of everything she had prepared for. But then, on the 18th of December, 36 days into her isolation, a subtle shift occurred. She was tuning to a local emergency frequency that had been broadcasting a continuous loop of evacuation shelter locations. She spun the dial, waiting for the familiar synthesized voice. But there was nothing, just the hiss of cosmic background radiation. She frowned, adjusting the squelch knob. She moved to the police band. Silence. She dialed into the massive, high-wattage, clear-channel AM stations out of the Midwest, the ones that could bounce signals off the ionosphere for thousands of miles. Nothing. Dead air. Meredith's heart rate spiked. A local transmitter freezing over was one thing, but a complete radio blackout across multiple bandwidths, that implied something far more catastrophic. An electromagnetic pulse? A coordinated attack? Or had the cold finally claimed the last of the operators? For the next 2 months, the silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The lack of information began to physically wear on her. The bunker, once a sanctuary, started to feel like a pressure cooker. She began to experience auditory hallucinations. She would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced she heard the rhythmic thumping of heavy boots on the cabin floor above, or the muffled, desperate scratching of someone trying to pry open the steel hatch. She would stand at the base of the stairs for hours, clutching a crowbar, holding her breath until her lungs burned, listening to the absolute, terrifying quiet of the earth. By February, She noticed her supplies weren't dwindling as fast as she had calculated, mostly because her appetite had vanished. She was losing weight. Her cheekbones became sharp, her eyes hollow, ringed with dark circles. The hydroponic tomatoes she grew tasted like ash. March came and went. The subterranean temperature probes embedded near the surface indicated that the ground above was finally, excruciatingly, beginning to thaw. The deep freeze was breaking. However, Meredith refused to open the door. If society had collapsed, the spring thaw would bring out the desperate, starving survivors. She needed to wait until the die-off was complete, until the new world had settled into its grim reality. It wasn't until late April, on the 163rd day of her isolation, that a mechanical failure forced her hand. A high-pitched, insistent alarm shattered the quiet of the bunker. Meredith dropped her book and scrambled to the environmental control panel. The primary air scrubber was flashing a vibrant, angry red. The secondary intake fan had seized, likely clogged with frozen moisture or debris from the surface. Carbon dioxide levels were slowly creeping up. She could fix it, but she needed parts she hadn't stockpiled, specific copper fittings she knew were in the garage of the cabin. She had no choice. She had to go up. Meredith strapped a heavy tactical knife to her thigh, slung a bolt-action rifle over her shoulder, and zipped up her insulated parka. Her hands trembled as she gripped the heavy hydraulic wheel of the blast door. She hadn't used these muscles in months. She strained, her boots slipping on the concrete, until she heard the agonizing screech of metal on metal. Clack, clack, clack. The locking pins retracted. She pushed upward. The door didn't budge. Panic flared in her chest. Had debris fallen on the hatch? Had the cabin burned down and buried the door in rubble? She positioned her shoulders under the steel, planted her legs, and pushed with a primal, terrified scream. With a crunching sound of breaking ice and snapping wood, the heavy door heaved open. Blinding, agonizingly bright, natural sunlight poured into the stairwell, stinging her dilated pupils. Meredith crawled up through the opening, blinking furiously, her rifle raised and ready. The air was crisp, smelling intensely of pine and damp earth. As her vision cleared, the rifle slowly lowered, slipping from her trembling fingers to clatter against the metal hatch. She wasn't standing in the pantry of her cabin. She was standing in the open air. The entire cabin, the foundation, the walls, the roof was gone. It hadn't burned. It had been violently sheared off the ground. Looking around, she saw the massive concrete pylons of her foundation exposed. The wood snapped clean like toothpicks. Disoriented, she stumbled forward, her boots sinking into the muddy, half-melted snow. She walked to the edge of her property, which overlooked the valley and the town of Blackwood below. She expected to see a post-apocalyptic wasteland. She expected to see burnt-out husks of buildings, roaming bands of survivors, or a valley choked with snow. Instead, Blackwood was perfectly intact. The rooftops were clear of snow, the streets were ploughed. The traffic lights at the main intersection were cycling merrily from green to yellow to red. But there were no cars. There was no smoke rising from any chimneys. The town was utterly, completely deserted. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the main access road leading into her neighborhood. Stretched across the asphalt, flapping violently in the spring breeze, was a massive, military-grade barricade made of concrete barriers and razor wire. Draped across it was a massive yellow banner with bold black lettering, Hazmat Quarantine Zone. Lethal exposure risk. Mandatory evacuation decree. November 13th. Meredith sank to her knees in the mud. The silence of the radio suddenly made horrific sense. The world hadn't ended. The power grid hadn't collapsed. While she had been safely locked in her bunker, deaf to the world, preparing for the Ice Age, the entire region had been permanently abandoned, and she had just walked out into the middle of it. The cold mud seeped through the knees of Meredith's denim jeans, but she couldn't feel it. Her mind, perfectly calibrated to process structural failures and grid collapses, short-circuited in the face of this impossible reality. The apocalypse had not been a global freezing or a societal breakdown. It had been localized, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly swift. She stood up, her legs trembling, and looked back at where her cabin used to be. The sheared wood and torn drywall weren't the result of the blizzard's winds. Looking closer at the perimeter of the foundation, she recognized the deep, massive tread marks of military-grade bulldozers. The army hadn't known she was down there. They had simply flattened her home, likely treating it as a contaminated structure to be leveled while establishing the quarantine perimeter along the ridge. Gripping her bolt-action rifle, Meredith began the 2-mile hike down the winding asphalt road into Blackwood. The silence was absolute, heavier than the quiet of her bunker, because it belonged to a space built for noise. Main Street was a mausoleum of interrupted lives. At Rusty's Diner, a neon open sign hummed faintly, running off a solar battery backup, casting a sickly red glow over the sidewalk. Peering through the reinforced glass, Meredith saw plates of food that had been snap-frozen by the November storm and subsequently rotted into unrecognizable piles of black mold during the spring thaw. Coffee mugs sat half-empty. Coats were still draped over the backs of booths. The people hadn't fled in a disorganized panic. They had been pulled out with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. She needed to know what had happened. She needed to know what she was currently breathing. Meredith bypassed the police station, assuming it would be locked down, and headed straight for Blackwood High School. During emergency protocols, large municipal buildings were always requisitioned as staging areas. Sure enough, the football field was unrecognizable. It was covered in large olive-drab FEMA tents and abandoned decontamination showers. The turf was torn up by the treads of heavy armored personnel carriers. She pushed through the flap of the largest command tent. The air inside was stale, smelling of ozone and bleached canvas. Tables were strewn with topographical maps, dead laptops, and half-drank bottles of water. Meredith rummaged through a stack of manila folders on a collapsible table labeled Commander Jennings, Sector 4 Oversight. She opened the top file. It was a preliminary incident report from the Environmental Protection Agency, dated November 14th, 2 days after she had locked the bunker door. The culprit wasn't a nuclear strike or a foreign invasion. It was the Hemlock Ridge Industrial Complex, a massive chemical processing plant 12 miles upriver, owned by a private contractor called the Apex Chemical Corporation. Meredith read the heavily redacted pages, her blood running cold. During the unprecedented blizzard, the extreme drop in barometric pressure, combined with temperatures plummeting to negative 55 degrees, had compromised the structural integrity of Apex's primary subterranean storage silos. A catastrophic pressure failure resulted in the release of over 60,000 gallons of an experimental military-grade defoliant and neuroinhibitor classified simply as Compound CX9. Compound CX9 was heavier than air. Instead of dissipating into the atmosphere, the violent storm winds had acted like a funnel, pushing the dense, invisible, and highly lethal gas directly down into the valley, blanketing Blackwood and the surrounding 50 square miles. Estimated mortality rate upon unprotected exposure, 100% within 4 minutes, the report read. The gas bonds to the soil and local flora, creating a semi-permanent zone of secondary exposure. Evacuation must be absolute. Meredith dropped the file. Her triple redundant air scrubbers hadn't just filtered out carbon dioxide. They had inadvertently filtered out a lethal nerve agent that had pooled in the valley above her. Her paranoia had accidentally saved her life. But her bunker hatch was currently open. The seals were broken. Panic flared, sharp and metallic in her throat. She looked at her bare hands. Was the toxin still active? The report mentioned secondary exposure from the soil. She desperately scanned the command tent and spotted a hard plastic case labeled Hazmat, Environmental Sensors. She popped the latches and pulled out a heavy yellow handheld chemical sniffer. She hit the power button. The device ran through a startup sequence, beeping sharply before the digital screen flickered to life. The ambient reading showed 0.04 parts per million of compound CX9. It wasn't zero, but it was far below the lethal threshold. The spring thaw and months of wind had dispersed the worst of the gas, but the town was still heavily contaminated. Long-term exposure would be a slow, agonizing death sentence. She could not go back to the bunker. The soil she had dragged down into the stairwell, the air now flowing freely into the open hatch, it was all compromised. She had to get out of the quarantine zone. Walking out wasn't an option. The perimeter was miles away, and hiking through the contaminated mud and brush would guarantee heavy secondary exposure. She needed a vehicle. Meredith left the high school and jogged down Elm Street, her breath pluming in the cool air, until she reached the property of Frank Peterson. Her elderly neighbor's house was dark and empty, but her eyes locked onto his detached garage. Frank was a retired mechanic, and for the past 5 years he had been obsessively restoring a 1978 Ford Bronco. It was analog, heavy, and built like a tank. She shattered the garage window with the butt of her rifle, reached in, and unlocked the side door. The Bronco sat in the center of the concrete floor, gleaming under a thick layer of dust. Meredith prayed Frank hadn't taken it during the evacuation. She yanked open the driver's side door. The keys weren't in the ignition. She tore through the workbench, pulling out drawers, scattering tools across the floor, until she found a spare set dangling from a pegboard behind a rusted wrench. She slid into the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she inserted the key. She pumped the gas pedal twice and turned the ignition. The old engine groaned, sputtered, and died. "Come on, Frank," she whispered, her voice cracking in the absolute silence of the garage. "You maintained this thing better than your own heart." She turned the key again, holding it. The starter whined in protest, fighting against months of dormant, freezing temperatures. Suddenly, the V8 engine caught, roaring to life with a deafening, beautiful rumble that shook the dust from the rafters. Meredith slammed the transmission into reverse, kicking the garage doors open with the heavy steel bumper, and backed out into the contaminated street. She navigated the deserted roads of Blackwood, driving past frozen tableaus of an abandoned world. As she merged onto the on-ramp for Interstate 70 East, the reality of the evacuation became terrifyingly clear. The highway was a graveyard of vehicles. Cars, trucks, and semi-trailers were scattered haphazardly across the lanes, abandoned by panicked drivers when the military had initiated the mandatory airlift and bus protocols. Meredith gripped the steering wheel, maneuvering the heavy Bronco over the highway median, driving on the shoulder to bypass a massive pileup of sedans. According to the maps she had seen in the command tent, the primary military barricade was established at the county line, right where the valley narrowed into a canyon pass. It was the only way out. 10 miles down the highway, the landscape began to change. The dead brown pines of the contaminated valley gave way to healthier, greener trees. Then, she saw it. Stretching across all 4 lanes of the interstate was a formidable wall of concrete jersey barriers, topped with looping coils of concertina wire. Flanking the barricade were 2 armored Humvees, their mounted heavy machine guns pointed directly down the highway. Above the barricade, a massive spotlight cut through the fading afternoon light, sweeping across the empty asphalt. Meredith hit the brakes, idling the Bronco a quarter-mile away. She couldn't just drive up. The military's orders regarding the quarantine zone were undoubtedly lethal. If they thought she was a looter, or worse, a contaminated vector trying to break quarantine, they would open fire. She grabbed her ham radio from her go bag, plugging it into the Bronco's cigarette lighter to boost the power. She tuned it to the standard military emergency frequency she had memorized months ago. She keyed the microphone. To the United States military personnel stationed at the Blackwood Canyon checkpoint. This is Dr. Meredith Foster. I am a civilian. I am unarmed. I am approaching your checkpoint in a blue Ford Bronco. Do not fire. Repeat. Do not fire. Silence. She repeated the message. Suddenly, a burst of static crackled over the radio, followed by a tense, incredulous voice. Unidentified vehicle on Interstate 70. This is Captain Miller, Colorado National Guard. Cut your engine immediately. You are in a lethal exclusion zone. Step out of the vehicle with your hands raised. Be advised, you are in the crosshairs of automated defense systems. Meredith exhaled a shaky breath. She killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. She pushed the heavy door open, raising her hands high above her head as she stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. Instantly, the massive spotlight tracked her, pinning her in a blinding, interrogating beam. Red laser sights danced across her chest. Keep your hands visible. Walk forward slowly. Captain Miller's voice boomed over a megaphone. Meredith walked, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she neared the concrete barriers, she could see the soldiers. They were wearing full Level A hazmat suits, their faces obscured by reflective visors and heavy respirators. They looked like astronauts. They looked at her like she was an alien. "Halt!" Miller ordered. Two soldiers flanked her, keeping a wide distance. One of them held up a long, pole-mounted chemical sniffer, waving it over her body. The machine beeped a rapid, low-pitched trill. Contamination confirmed. "Captain," the muffled voice of the soldier called out. "But levels are extremely low. It's surface residue." Captain Miller stepped forward, his voice tight with disbelief behind his mask. "Ma'am, Sector 4 has been sealed for 6 months. The atmospheric toxicity levels were fatal for the first 90 days. How are you alive?" Meredith lowered her hands, a hollow, exhausted laugh escaping her lips. She looked back toward the ghost town, then back at the soldiers. "I was waiting for the world to end," Meredith said softly, the weight of her isolation finally crashing down on her. "I guess I just missed it." 2 hours later, Meredith was sitting inside a sterile, brightly lit decontamination chamber at a secure CDC facility 50 miles outside the zone. A federal official named Agent Harrison sat across from her, recording her every word as she detailed the depths of her bunker, the triple redundant scrubbers, and the terrible silence of the radio. She had survived the deadliest chemical disaster in American history by locking herself in a tomb to avoid a snowstorm. Her paranoia had been her salvation. But as she stared out the small window of the facility at the bustling, functioning world, she had been so desperate to hide from a world that had moved on entirely without her, she realized the ultimate, terrifying truth of her survival. She hadn't outlasted the apocalypse. She had just built her own. If Meredith's terrifying subterranean isolation and her desperate escape from a ghost town kept you on the edge of your seat, do not let this story fade into the darkness. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this gripping real-life nightmare with your friends. And make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next incredible tale of survival.